Thanks again for Fight the Dogs community for throwing this awesome gig for us tonight. So, as some of you already know, or some of you whom I didn't speak personally yet, I'm Kate, and I'm a technical writer currently living in Kyiv, Ukraine. And I've been creating different sorts of technical content since 2012, and usually I do that in collaboration with often distributed and culturally diverse teams. I'm also a proud dog mom, as you can see on the slide, of a 1-year-old pup named Dripply, and that can give away, I guess, my favorite action hero of all time, who is not talented Mr. Ripley, just so you know. So a few months ago, I joined a new company, a new project, and this is a automotive project. We try to help make your navigation safe and precise if you're a driver, and for car manufacturers to be able to distribute and gather data safely. And that's why we came up with the not new, but we didn't come up with, but we've implemented in our own way a concept of neutral server, which is a product and like a new feature that, as I said before, gathers and distributes personal data in a safe manner and can help make your driving experience more efficient, and for people who want to sell you services, be able to do that without annoying you and without exploiting your personal data. So when I actually joined this project, and especially development team, I realized that the team has been working on this new major product feature, which is neutral server, for at least 6 months or so at that point. So one of my first questions was, so what are our business goals, and what have we been following before, and where are we heading to, and what's our basically content strategy? And that ended up, well, I can say that was a conversation starter for sure, because we ended up with the whole team discussing our content strategy planning, content strategy pitfalls, focusing around planning, because it turned out that there wasn't a clear, concise, or comprehensive strategy for long term, and all the heavy lifting was divided between product owner and UX designer, and apart from that, and in addition to that, a technical writer, or not to mention UX writer, was involved in the project as a part-time team player. So it resulted in some significant content planning gaps, and sometimes harsh deadlines and urgent deploys and fixes. So but eventually what happened was, and also add to that, if you had like different time zones for major team players that work on this feature and trying to come up with a solid concept, if they're working in different time zones, oh boy, things can get tricky. So that's why today I decided to share some of the things that did go wrong, and what the team and I came up with along the way, and what helped us to plan moving forward, and avoiding some stuff that might just demolish our content creation moving forward. So that's why I decided to put together some of the critical pitfalls, in my opinion, which we managed to identify, and which you should look out if you are noticing that it's happening, and especially if you're joining the project or development team not from the very beginning, because that's like an ideal case, But if you've joined them somewhere along the way, a lot of things can go wrong. Let's just say that. So one of the things that I've noticed for sure is when one of the crucial things is when you put your end result and end goal of your whole development and your content strategy as the highest priority over all the little things and details, and vice versa. Because if you only start thinking about your end goal, end result, without considering all the milestones in between, you can actually lose so much data, and so much gaps can come up along the way that you, in the end, you won't have any time or any resources to kind of risk manage it at the very last moment. And the other side of that is when you trying to make everything so perfect, you're super concentrated on details. You want to make every message, every copy to hit that right note, which is. And I think that can lead to the next thing, which is lack of impact or involvement within your team and with other teams. Because even if you're a UX designer, then you're probably more involved with development team or product management team on a daily basis. But if you're strictly content creator, then I think it can be quite frustrating especially if you're the only one who's doing all the heavy lifting in terms of content creation. Because even from my personal experience, there were times when, and in different projects, on some of them I was focusing on mainly user guides or release notes, so something that's facing just the end user. But sometimes it can be internal documentation. So when you talk about it, you understand the significance of what you're creating, and you know that there are a lot of users who are going to get your content, get the end product. But sometimes, of course, I wouldn't say that this role is super new, but being a UX writer, for sure, it sounds newer for a lot of product owners, especially, and sometimes it's really hard to get in touch with the whole team and make them realize that your resources and time is also available in terms of you require the same feedback and, let's say, code review, but content review as well as any other developer on the team. So that's why it's a good thing to not get frustrated when you see that things are stagnating and you cannot get in touch with whoever is in charge of the whole project. But make sure you reach out to as many people as possible who do have influence, that they hear you, that you are there, and make your work visible. And because you face it on a daily basis, and of course you understand the significance, but other people might not see the big picture and where your results stand out in that big picture, and you need to make those things visible and communicate it with the team on a daily basis more frequently. And that's why I think that identifying dependencies when it's probably or might be too late is also an important thing, because it goes hand in hand with allocating your resources. You want to ask yourself as early as possible, what can I isolate and what are dependencies in terms of time, deadlines, other people who might help you out. For say, you want some input from development team and you want a business perspective from product owners, but at the same time you have to keep in mind that when your work is done, it's not completely done because there's a QA team, or you would like to have your users' feedback. So that's something that also a good thing to keep in mind, because if you just look at your task as a standalone task, or it's just one of many assigned to an epic, then things might not get done in a long-term perspective, or you might just lose the touch with reality of where you're standing. And also, I think what's also important to remember is that resources is not just person or his time, but it's also what kind of tools do you need. If you want to use when you're thinking about content in general, you also might be thinking about not just short-term goals, like so there's a release date, so we have to put out the release notes at this date, or we're updating this chapter of user guide or user manual, or there's a new feature and there are new messages that are gonna pop up in front of user when he clicks through the flow. But just keep in mind for instance, long-term goals, which might be localization if you're expanding in like 1 or 3 years. So resources is also man hours, costs that some tools might require, and that's why it's important to plan not just with your own time, but with keeping in mind the resources of your team and your company in general as a whole. And what we've talked about tonight a lot, I think, is how important it is to get an actual feedback from people who will be using, or who will see the things that we have actually come up with and what we've translated and how it works. So that's why I think if you do have, if you're able to, and you have the resources to do a pilot project or proof of concept, or get an actual feedback from your customer on minimal viable product, which of course we're not talking about like internal demos with your team, where you actually show your pages, your mockups, wireframes with all the content, where you like get reviews on your like internal pages or other pieces of content. But pilot project or proof of concept really gives you a perspective of what worked, what might be done better, what we can improve, and really get that user feedback, which is super helpful. And I think again, it sounds obvious about disrupted communication and lack of communication within the team, but I've seen it happening so often that I decided just not to skip it, because it often just boils down to not having frequent meetings, or having too many meetings where you maybe discuss a lot of important stuff, but it's all jammed up in one day. So you have 2/3 of the day crammed with meetings where you're trying to solve everything in one piece, and then your brain is mushed and you're trying to come up with another brilliant phrase for your message or for your pop-up screen. And also in terms and in context of content strategy, I think it's important to again just communicate of what's coming, so it's not a surprise for other groups that you're working with, and especially for people who are going to review and give you feedback on your content. So, and it works for both your managers, for just people who you're working with on a daily basis, who are collaborating with you. So it's just don't just like, it's a good thing to get out there and try to use corporate channels as much as possible, whatever you see, whatever works best for you. So that's always a good thing. So now when we've discussed like what can go wrong, let's just turn to some positives, which hopefully there are more of them actually, because everyone who's working in agile, not community but atmosphere, knows that it can be a bit chaotic, but at the same time everyone is able to self-organize, and you can get a lot of positive things when working. So whenever you're working on your content strategy, or if there is an existing one and you're trying to improve it, it's always good to tie it back to your business goals. Always keep it in mind and try to look ahead. And as I mentioned before, don't just think about like short-term goals, even if you're not like planning to stick with this company for like the rest of your life, say like 10 years ahead. But it will really help you if you put in perspective the pieces that you're working on and what you've envisioned, like how it's aligned with your current company goals, and what the company is trying to achieve, and again, how does your content resonate with those goals moving forward. Keeping budgeting and resources in mind. Also, it sounds familiar. We all understand that it's important, but I think we can all agree that if you only consider budgeting in terms of how much the cost of just the cost of work, that's not the overall planning that you have to keep in mind, because again, you might need some tools for localization, you might need to review the systems, you might need to think about challenges that might come along the way, because for instance, for our new feature, one of the plans for next year is to actually enter a market where you cannot share data outside the country. So like, what kind of resources do you need to keep the infrastructure of the content? Like, how will it look the same? Like, what internal resources do we need? And will it actually physically look the same as, say, documents or pieces that we have for Europe, for instance? And yes, it also ties to planning. Implementation is as important as planning the strategy, because just planning the strategy is like putting together a roadmap. It's not going to implement or execute itself, and that's when thinking ahead and thinking about time comes into play, because you need to make sure that you're connected to all the people who actually, for instance, are going to build your content and put it out there, make it visible on your website, for say. Because, for instance, when I finish working on release notes, I cannot wrap up, like say 2 days before the release, because there's a whole team who is responsible for committing and pushing them to make the whole documentation build, and then actually for the docs to go live on the website. So you need to keep that in mind, so that you're not the only one who's working, and there's a whole chain. Again, if we're at least speaking about like middle-sized company or project, because you cannot do everything yourself in terms of technical execution. I think sometimes it's possible if you're responsible for a lot of things, but there are still some things that we cannot execute without QA team and a backend team. So yeah, evaluation of the scope and prioritizing short-term and long-term goals will definitely save you time, and you will not end up in sleepless nights thinking about how do I manage it, and you won't be hopefully caught between two phases, like standby or waiting mode and delivering tomorrow at 6 a.m. So that's also a good thing to avoid. And yeah, don't forget to build in some time for quality assurance, not just for user feedback, but most of the time, or a lot of times, you will be facing with, and you will be working with QA team who will actually be putting your, especially front end, who will be testing it, and it may look pretty when you're working with UX designer and you know it should work. I mean, it looks great. But do communicate with those guys and give them a heads up, because of course they know that something new is coming, but you want to make sure that you're on the same page with them, because again, when it comes to translation of content, it's also a huge part where you need to test does all that translated message actually squeezes into the window that you've envisioned or got in mind, and sometimes it looks pretty weird. Yeah. And last but not least, I think it's just being mindful about the impact of your content strategies on other groups that you're working with, and making it visible. I think it ties everything together in terms of make sure that your content strategy and how you communicate about it is in line with your internal standards or your internal vision. Make sure that it's public, but not in terms of like publicly public outside your team, group, or company, but make sure people are knowing what's coming ahead. And if other teams are messaging in some other way, or they might have their own input, which might be very useful, because something might not be technically possible. And before you actually say it out loud, you will never know like what's possible, if this vision is just perfect as you imagined it, and if you can actually make it happen in reality. So far, so good. And before we all start asking questions or just leave, I hope you don't mind if we take group selfie, just for my personal archive, because you know, if there isn't a content or a document, did it really happen? Yeah. So I'll actually. Hello, Ride the Dogs, Stockholm. Thanks everyone for coming. Yay! Thank you. So yeah, that's it. Yes.
I really like the sticker that's on your computer.
Oh,
and I think UX writers have a lot to learn. Content people have a lot to learn from the UX professionals that have been sort of through this journey during the last sort of 10, 15 years.
Oh yeah.
Selling their work and making people understand what they're doing, what the values of what they're doing, reminding people of always putting the user in the center of things. I think we need to do the same thing.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I agree. I strongly support and agree. Okay. Oh yeah, sorry. I mean, sorry, it's just blinding. I didn't see you. Yep.
You're working agile?
Yeah, I do work with teams in sprints. So yeah.
You have a process. I guess you're several teams and you are working with several.
Mm-hmm.
Have a checklist in your process that all the documentation also needs to be.
Yeah. Yeah, I do have.
You have they see their process, but also documentation comes in
Yeah.
the process.
I try to get it out there as much as possible, and for instance, besides just attending like all the meetings, plannings, or reviews or demos, I think it's important to first of all decompose the tasks and have a checklist for at least every task or every like piece of content or document that you're working on. Yeah. Yeah, I know you mean the other.
I mean definition of done.
Yeah, there is, yes.
All those things needs to be checked before you set this task list down.
Yeah, such checklist exists, and I think one of the approaches that would work in most cases is at first define again like long-term and short-term tasks and their impact, because for instance as I said, I cannot define a task or a document as done just because I finished working on it, because there is a procedure, and we at least have it documented that it has to go through review and verification, and it has to be like you have to see the test build of documentation, how it actually looks. At first we have to take a look how it looks on the internal website or documentation portal, and then we can put it out. So yeah, of course there should be a checklist or definition of done for docs as well. And the other like hot topic, I think, which is similar to that, like how do you actually plan content development, because you can use, developers at least, they can use t-shirt sizing or story points, but you cannot actually use story points for, I don't know, creating release notes. So, but you have to measure it somehow. You have to communicate it with the rest of the team so they know like where you are. So I think we should try to implement some of the best stuff that Agile can offer, maybe adjust it a little bit, but yeah, I think it is true. Okay.